you very much. And thank you to IIRSM for inviting me along to facilitate what I think is an absolutely critical webinar on how to address mental health risk within your management system. Now, on every webinar that I present, I always begin with a safety moment. And the safety moment is to set the context of the content of the webinar. And the safety moment that I've chosen for this particular webinar is, as all good safety moments should be, from a personal experience. In January of 2019, I was working in a relatively senior position for a super major oil and gas company, and I had a number of people working for me, one of which worked offshore. This person wasn't just somebody who worked for me. This person was more than that. They were a personal friend who, when they came back onshore, would come to my house and we would spend time together watching rugby games, and our partners would spend time together as well. We were, you could describe us as very close friends. When this person was offshore in, like I say, January 2019, I was receiving the usual amount of WhatsApp messages, which I would get the informal information from, the really juicy information. The formal information would come to my official email account with his daily reports, but the really interesting things that, you know, the information that we could use to make positive, meaningful change would come to me via a WhatsApp conversation between the two of us. I received a WhatsApp from him. It wasn't to do with work. It was basically a joke that he'd heard on the rig, and true to rights, it was extremely funny. He signed off for the day. I signed off for the day. I went home. He went to the galley to get his meal, and then start his evening, which would usually begin in the recreation room and then go through to the gym and then go back to his cabin, sleep, get up, go to work the next day. Unfortunately, on that day in question, he didn't do that. On that day in question, he felt compelled to put his coveralls on, go outside, and I'm very sorry to say, take his own life by jumping overboard. Now, this deeply affected everybody on the rig, everybody within every organization that was involved in the drilling campaign that we were driving forward, and it had a obvious devastating effect on his family. Now, excuse me. He left 2 suicide notes in his cabin. He left 1 suicide note for his wife, and he left 1 suicide note for me. So the police were involved, and eventually my suicide note came back to me, and his final words within his suicide note was, "I only wish I could talk." And the contents of his suicide note described brilliantly the way that he felt like he was caught in a place that wasn't really the world that the rest of us have, and he couldn't break free from it. And it wasn't like he didn't try, he just couldn't. And the funny thing, obviously it wasn't funny, but the strange thing was that we had a mental health medical professional go out to the rig and talk to everyone afterwards. And she heard what happened and specifically came to talk to me. And I said to her, in the days leading up to this event, I'm very surprised because my friend actually seemed happier. And she said, yes, that's quite common because they can see the end and they've made a decision. They can see a way out. So I wanted to start this webinar with that very, very serious safety moment to put us kind of in the frame for what we're going to talk about today. Suicide, male suicide, is still the biggest killer of men under the age of 45 within the UK. And it's not their fault. They just can't break free, an awful lot of them. But what we can do is we can try and help them. We can ask them if they're okay, and we can leave doors open that they can walk through. And an awful lot of what we're going to talk about today will be about opening those doors. Now, I haven't designed these slides with suicide in mind. That is just one part of a far, far bigger and extremely complex puzzle. And it is a puzzle in a lot of places. But what we're going to do today is talk through a framework, a journey map of what we can all do to facilitate more understanding and more openness within our own organizations. And with that, I will go to the next slide. So let's frame what we're going to talk about today. What this webinar is not. It's not a clinical discussion of mental health conditions. I am not qualified for that. I am not a medical professional. It's not going to give you any specific quantification of mental health risk, although that is something that I'd be qualified to do in a conversation that I would welcome. We're not going to have any subjective opinion with any biased context. We're just going to keep to the facts. And hopefully we're all going to acknowledge that a one-size-fits-all is sometimes the best we can do. But I think we all know that it's not actually, in the perfect world, what's really required. And you're going to have to make your own organization-specific journey map. We won't be providing it in this webinar, but we will be showing you how to do it. So what this webinar is, well, it's going to be a forum for intelligent discussion on the process, and I can't wait to get your questions at the end. All the risk data and all the data that I'm going to present is all valid source data. The meta-analysis that I've talked about, so the joining together of different studies, is all objective expert opinion that I'll be quoting. None of it is mine, although I will obviously give opinion throughout, but I will try and minimize that. And it's also an acknowledgement that there needs to be an awful lot more research on this topic. But ultimately, as the last bullet point says, what we're going to be doing today is giving you the building blocks that you can use to put together your own lasting change within your organizations. So what we'll do is we'll start with, well, who am I? Why on earth should you listen to me? After that, we'll go on to make an attempt at a cost estimate of mental health, in what it costs organizations, what it costs the economy as a whole. And I'm talking about just monetary value there. I'm not talking about the cost that happens to the families, which is ultimately the largest cost. We're going to rationalize the commercial case. We're going to take those costs and use them. And then we're going to talk about the core standards and give you a framework that all organizations can use. After that, we're going to talk about designing a better employee experience. And then I'm going to talk about what the first steps are for yourself after this webinar. So, who am I? Why should you listen to me? Well, I'm Steve Harris. I run Integrity HSE. I'm a fellow of the IIRSM, and I deeply believe in the organization. I think that its values and its charter are something that are exceptional. I'm also a fellow with the Institute of Leadership and Management, and I'm a chartered fellow with the Chartered Management Institute, and a chartered member with IOSH as well. The book that you can see down on the bottom right-hand side there, I'm very, very proud and happy to say that I published my first book on the subject of leadership, and I talk quite extensively about the role of a leader in providing an environment that encourages wellness, well-being, and positive mental health outcomes. I'm also seen as a bit of an influencer. I lecture at Robert Gordon's University and do a number of things for some membership organizations that you can see up on the screen. I'm looking at the screen, which is why my eyes are away from the camera a little bit. And I've been fortunate enough to work for some incredible organizations, from Lloyd's Register to Total Energies. I've been very, very, very fortunate with my career. And with my last appointment, which was with Visus Group, another organization I really enjoyed working with before I started Integrity HSE, I was their global head of HSSE, and we were a technical and engineering consultancy in several countries, and doing some really interesting things in high reliability industries, the likes of nuclear, oil and gas, etc. So that's who I am. So hopefully that gives me a little bit of credibility. So let's set the scene. And I've created this slide pack so that you will get offered it in a PDF afterwards, so you can take away and you can use this as part of your business case yourself, or potentially give bits out to your personnel in order to coach, mentor, and raise the understanding of mental health. So 1 in 4 people in the UK will have a mental health problem at some point. And whilst mental health problems are common, most are mild, tend to be short-term, normally successfully treated by a GP, either with medication or simple counselling. What it means is it's about how we feel, and how we behave. And anxiety and depression are the most common mental health problems, and we'll get into the statistics behind them in a second. And they are often a reaction to a difficult life event, but can also be caused by work-related issues. Work can also aggravate pre-existing conditions, and problems at work can bring on symptoms or make their effects worse. So if I'm speaking to anyone that's a performance specialist, which in a way every HSE professional is, then hopefully there should be a little alarm bells ringing just now, thinking, okay, there's a bigger picture here, so to speak. So whether work is causing the health issue or aggravating it, employers do in the UK have a legal responsibility to help their employees. And work-related mental health issues must be assessed to measure the levels of risk to staff. Where a risk is identified, steps must be taken to remove it or reduce it as far as reasonably practicable. And something that I haven't gone into in a huge amount of detail in this presentation, but something that you should definitely be having a look at if you're not already, is the stress risk assessment on the HSE's website. All information, as it is with the HSE, is free, and the information is exceptionally well presented in a really user-friendly and intuitive format. Also, something to talk about is some employees will also have pre-existing physical or mental health conditions when recruited, or may actually develop one caused by factors that are not work-related. And employers have to be very, very careful about this, because there may be further legal requirements, and they may stretch into the blurry, ambiguous, and it is world of equalities legislation, which is something that you really would require specialist support on. So in 2021-22, the HSE produced their figures, and the number of workers suffering work-related illness was thought to be in the region of, what was reported to be in the region of 1.8 million. Now, out of that 1.8 million, an estimated 914,000 cases were directly related to work stress, depression, and anxiety. And this totaled an estimated 17 million working days, which is over half of all the working days lost due to work-related ill health. It is an incredible issue that we're not talking about enough. If that figure was down to another occupational illness or safety issue that resulted in broken limbs, this would be dealt with far more efficiently. So the HSE's chief executive, Sarah Albon, said stress and poor mental health is the #1 cause of work-related ill health. The effects of stress, depression, and anxiety can have a significant impact on an employee's life and on their ability to perform their best work. Again, I've put a lot of this in so that you can take it yourself and put it into your own company presentations. So in recent years prior to the pandemic, the rate of self-reported work-related stress, depression, or anxiety had shown signs of increasing. So the levels that we're at today are not a shock. The current rate is higher than the 2018-2019 pre-coronavirus levels. That won't be a shock to anyone on the call, I imagine. So the work days lost per worker due to self-reported work-related stress, depression and anxiety show no actual clear trend that we can use in any kind of predictive sense. In 2021-22, the effects of the pandemic were found to be a major contributory factor to work-related stress, depression, or anxiety. But again, as I said earlier, there's such a myriad of understanding that needs to go on to actually reverse engineer and derive the issue that we're actually dealing with here. So, as you can see within the infographics there are certain industries with higher rates recently, and yeah, the trends are, although they're not predictive, you can see that they're not really linear in any fashion. We can predict they're going to go up. So I did a bit of research because I'm a fiend for numbers. So I love investigations, I love statistics and things like that. So I had a look, and I found that the prevalence of self-reported work related by age and gender from 2018 to 2019 to 2021, it gave us some really interesting results. So I then cross-checked that with the prevalence for work related by occupation. Then I threw in workplace size, and then I threw in the prevalence of self-reported that was meant to be caused by or made worse by work. And by the examination of those numbers, what became very, very obvious was that we really should be definitely talking to professional females in large companies about their workloads. They are a vulnerable group. But I guess what I'm doing there is saying, you know, this is something that we need to talk about. This is a bigger picture group and a bigger picture argument, a bigger picture discussion. But whilst we're putting all the pieces in that puzzle, there certainly are groups of people who we need to be, I don't want to say targeting, but recognizing as being more vulnerable than others. So let's have a look at a cost estimate. So on the left-hand side of that slide, you'll see that mental health, what they phrase as problems, cost the UK economy at least, so this is a minimum prudent figure, of 117.9 billion per year sterling. And you can see the breakdown country by country there. But on the far right of this slide, you'll also note that these estimates are thought conservative because they do not include things like absenteeism, poor performance in work, another way to say presenteeism, a bum on a seat, but a bum on a seat that's not really being productive, and things like staff turnover, things like that. You know, and then training the new staff that come in, etc. And this part of the puzzle, which we can't yet quantify, is estimated to cost the economy another 42 to 45 billion a year. And let's also not forget that specialist mental health care costs are estimated to be about 13 billion. So this is in the center of the slide. And that's 11% of the total costs. And these costs reflect service use, but don't include the unmet need. In England in 2019, 44% of mental health service providers reported being unable to meet the current demands for inpatient services, rising to 58% for community mental health services and 81% for child and adolescent mental health services. So now we have a relative understanding of the cost and the impact in order to meet that hazard burden and the quantum of risk that we require in the UK in order to have any chance of being able to say that we have an ALARP risk profile in terms of this, what is in itself a pandemic, an epidemic. We need to invest. And as our commercial acumen will dictate. We need to invest in a way that's going to give us a return. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. And there's a number of proofs that have been given to us about the return on investment in mental health initiatives and in mental health change. So what I wanted to provide you with was a timeline, and the source for this timeline is in the bottom right of the slide, and I would encourage you to have a look at that document a little bit in more detail. But with every industry and every organization, every member of our workforce being fantastically unique, that's what makes life brilliant. The data and/or the logic does not suggest that a one-size-fits-all approach would actually work. So as we said at the start, sometimes the likes of national governments, sometimes membership bodies, etc., have to push a one-size-fits-all because something is better than nothing, but it really is up to, as I've said before, the people on this call to bespoke and tailor that to their own organization, or reach out to the likes of myself, and I can help, and I would love to help. So a targeted, multifaceted approach is usually what works best and brings a range of preventative and mitigating measures to the workplace, which hedges risk and yields reward. And the fantastic thing about doing this type of almost pick and mix approach is that for the potential skeptics within your senior leadership teams and the people that hold the purse strings, you can come in with a relatively mild approach, show the return on that, and then begin the step up with more and more budget in order to give more and more return on investment. So you can see that within our timeline here, or timeline format, you can have a 10.2 to 1 return on investment with a program including screening, personalized feedback, and referral to an occupational physician. And that was came from data and numerous case studies that were done back in 2015. And that in itself is bookending one part of the ROI model. On the other part of the ROI model, it begins with a 0.4 to 1, and that's talking about the likes of computer-based training that's delivered by a therapist. Obviously, computer-based training in itself is inherently perhaps not best suited to addressing something that is such a human factor as mental health, but it certainly has a role to play in terms of education, coaching, mentoring. But it's really more of a human approach that works better, as you can see with the 10.2 to 1, where you have an occupational physician actually involved in personal feedback, etc., and screening. So yeah, I thought that would be an interesting slide for you. So the core standards and a framework for the organization, which is something we should all be thinking about. And just in case you're thinking about starting to take notes just now, I just want to remind you again that this presentation will be PDF'd and sent out to you. And I have constructed it in a way that you can use it as a reference document going on. But what we need to do is, or what we should be thinking and considering anyway, is to produce, implement, and communicate a mental health at work plan. That would come from an initial risk assessment, which would inform our plan, and then we'd harmonize it with our company strategy and find out what we wanted to do, and then produce that mental health at work plan. We need to develop mental health awareness among employees. That's been shown to give a massive ROI. We need to normalize the conversation. So in the same way as I'm a retired old rugby player, and I've got issues with one of my arms where I took a big hit during a game, and you know what, some days it's great and some days it's not so great. In the same way as I would be both naive and ignorant to think that my mental health wasn't some days great and some days not great. But it needs to be kept within a healthy range, and when I start to notice behavioral changes or something like that, that's when I know that, you know, I need to speak to someone, or I need to reach out for help. That's the kind of openness that we need to commonly talk about, in the same way as we walk into our office when our arm's in a sling and say, my arm's sore, We need to be able to walk in there and say, you know what, I'm feeling a bit down recently. And that's why we need to encourage open conversations about mental health and the support available when employees are struggling. But we don't need to force these upon employees. We don't need to force people to open up and talk about things, because everybody's different and some people just aren't made that way. We need to, as employees, not only economically and legally, but morally as well, provide good working conditions and development opportunities, whilst also encouraging a healthy work-life balance. We can't force a healthy work-life balance, but we can certainly educate and coach our personnel in order to what they generally need as a human being in order to function at that level close to self-actualization, and that's not 24/7 work. We also need to promote effective people management throughout our line managers and supervisors. One of the reasons that I wrote the book that I told you about earlier on was because I come from quite a strange quasi-military background, and I was very fortunate enough to have been given some wonderful, wonderful training in leadership, which hopefully led to a leadership competency. But when I was speaking to senior leaders in the energy industry and asking them about their leadership competency, they would tell me about a management course that they went on 10 years ago, which is not leadership. It's a completely different thing. So what we tend to do is, and don't get me wrong, the leadership in the energy industry in the UK is impressive. It's good. Can it be better? Of course it can. Everything can be better, but it is good. But what we tend to do within industry in the UK is perpetuate the Peter principle. So we will promote people to their level of, I don't want to say incompetence, but we will promote them to a level where they're uncomfortable. We'll take an engineer in a pool of engineers and promote him into being an engineering manager, or her into an engineering manager, rather than taking the best potential engineering manager candidate and promoting them. So subsequently, we have line managers and supervisors who are not even comfortable in that position, never mind comfortable in then leaning over to a subject which an awful lot of very experienced line managers and supervisors are not comfortable or competent to talk about. So we need to take it on board that there is some coaching and there is some mentoring needed in every single level of the organization. And we also need to routinely monitor employee mental health and well-being. We need to find out some success criteria and keep our eye on that as well. If you're the type of organization that is still monitoring reactive failures in terms of first aid cases, medical treatment cases, etc., then in the same way as the law has recognized that employment can negatively impact our employees in terms of mental health, we also need to be capturing our failures in that place so that we can investigate and we can find ways forward. So I did a bit of research myself, and I did this last year. This is a webinar I've done a number of times, and I always bring this slide up. So I reached out to my LinkedIn network and said, I'm hosting a webinar next Wednesday. We'll be talking about how to include mental health risk within a management system. I'd love to build a poll into my presentation, hence the poll. So what do you think is the leading cause of poor mental health within the workplace? And again, it came down to poor leadership and support. And some of the excellent comments that I got from my network, you can see there on the right-hand side. And I would encourage you to use these as building blocks with your coaching and mentoring of your line managers and your supervisors. So we've got the likes of office politics, unnecessary bureaucracy, micromanagement, unrealistic expectations from both sides, unrealistic goals, but also, interestingly, pressure from family to manage the work-life balance. But pressure from family to manage the work-life balance, there's a double-edged sword with that. Why is the family pressuring you to manage the work-life balance? Is it because work is stretching into your personal life? So, yeah, I thought I'd put this there for your information. Hopefully, you can get some value from it. So what's been done on a national level? Well, relatively speaking, quite a lot recently. Back in 2017, Theresa May recognized the issue, was informed of the issue anyway, and as the slide says, she said that many employers are already creating healthy, inclusive workplaces, but more needs to be done so that employers provide the support needed for employees with mental health conditions. And far, far more than that, the PM could have said about, provide support needed for employees with mental health conditions, but they need to create workplaces so that work does not contribute to employees developing mental health conditions. One of the pet peeves of mine is when I go to help an organization, which I love doing, and I sit down and I always ask them for a quick brief of what they have in place so far. And one of the things that I'm invariably told is, Steve, we've got mental health first aiders and they're brilliant. I always kind of sit there and say, okay, so I need to balance that reactive off of proactive. So what are you doing? Like proactively, and I get, well, we've got mental health first aiders. And when somebody tells me they've got a mental health first aider in their office, I think that's fantastic. You've recognized there's a problem, but that's like me sitting there saying, you know what, I've got a first aider in my office because I understand people keep on breaking their arms. Well, wouldn't it make sense to go back and stop people breaking their arms so we don't need the first aiders? So please remember that there's reactive measures, but there's also proactive measures. So Theresa May commissioned the Stevenson Pharma report, which was told everyone what they already knew, but it was groundbreaking at the time to have the trade's suspicions validated. And as it said, the Prime Minister announced on the 9th of January that she was asking us to carry an independent review into how employers can better support individuals currently in employment, including those with mental ill health, or poor well-being to remain in and thrive through work. A far better description than the PM had given. So what they did was, in the conclusion of their study, they found 6 areas which were absolutely critical. So they got all the data together, and I'm a big fan of the Stevenson Pharma report, and they reversed engineered it and derived it down into 6 real areas of where, as business owners and influencers, as everyone on this call is, where we really need to spend our time. So the first one was demands of the job, and this was where employees indicate that they can and can't cope with the demands of the job. And what we really need is systems in place locally to respond to the individual's concerns. And what the solutions look like in terms of demands, that adequate and achievable demands in relation to the agreed hours of work. So when was the last time that we went back and actually revisited our job description or our scope of work with our personnel and said, are you actually doing that? And here's your contracted hours, and how are we doing it within those hours? And is this actually achievable? And that's why people's skills and abilities really need to be matched to the job demands. And as the job changes, then we need to also reskill and change our people's skills and abilities to match that going forward. We need to design the jobs so that they're within the capability of employees, and we need to make sure that employees' concerns about their work environment are also proactively addressed so that they have that empowerment, they have that feeling, and that feeling is developed through actual evidence that they can see change in the workplace, that they do have the power to make their working environment a better place and more suitable for them individually. The second area that Stevenson Pharma identified was control, and that's that employees indicate that they have a say or don't have a say about the way they work. And we need systems in place locally to address those as well. So where possible, employees have control over the pace of their work. And this takes a different dimension of management to control. It's very much less presenteeism, less your success criteria is measured by the amount of time that you spend in your seat, and more an amalgamation of management by objective as well. So employees are encouraged also to use their skills and initiative to do their work. So it's like a good engine. You run it optimally at about 80% so that the employee is not bored, but they're not overly cognitively tasked. They're just in the right place. They're encouraged to develop new skills to help undertake new pieces of work. And the organization also encourages them to develop their own skills. And they have a say over when breaks can be taken, and employees are consulted over their work patterns. It was Henry Ford back in, I want to say 1926, that came up with the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, and that was done in order to facilitate a production line. Most of us don't work on production lines anymore, and certainly the pandemic has shown us that most organizations, a high percentage of those that survived the pandemic, work with a certain amount of agility, and this needs to be integrated into working patterns and employees consulted. The next bucket was to do with support, and that's that adequate information and support from both colleagues and supervisors. So peer-to-peer, line manager to line report. And this means that the organization has policies and procedures to adequately support employees. I work with numerous clients, and one of the things I help them do is build management systems. And the amount of management systems that I have assessed in the past that haven't been balanced against job description or workload monitoring is incredible. So companies come up with management systems and expect employees to fulfill what's in the management system, but there has been no almost quantification or counting of the job descriptions that are in place. So we have one person in place that has a job description that says they're going to do that for this amount of hours. And then we times that by the amount of employees we have, which is maybe 20, but we've got a management system that requires another 20 people in order to satisfy. That mismatch creates a dichotomy, which brings friction into the workplace. And this is something, as leaders of organizations, it's a basic management function that we need to be very careful of keeping an eye on. So we need to make sure that systems are in place to enable and encourage managers to support their staff, and systems are in place to enable and encourage employees to support their colleagues, so that we have the safe spaces, so that we have the quiet rooms, so that we have the ability to take ourselves away from what is sometimes a very, very busy, very noisy, and very distracting working place, to cognitively relax in a safe space and facilitate that conversation that sometimes needs to happen. And when I say sometimes needs to happen, what I really mean is always needs to happen to every single one of us every now and again in order to keep our performance where we really need it to be. Employees have to be aware of the support that is available and how and when to access it. A very common thing that we'll all hear about is the Employee Assistance Program, the EAP, which certainly in the larger organizations is very, very prevalent, and they will have confidential phone numbers through to counselors and professionally qualified support staff, which is excellent. It means that our line managers and our colleagues can be the first port of call for somebody who thinks they have an issue. But if they have received a level of training from you that they then exhaust during that conversation, then they can say, okay, so the next step up is to go and speak to a professional. So you're exhibiting some signs which we need to get professional opinion on, and we can point people towards it, but people need to know it's there. But quite often in organizations, mental health is still that subject that we don't want to talk about, so we don't regularly promote the fact that an EAP is there. So it needs to be active in conversations, from safety moments, from onboarding, from HR, from your management system, and openly talked about and openly encouraged by influencers within your organization. And they need to give access to the required resources to do their job so that they're not being inventive and putting undue pressure on themselves. And they also need to receive regular and constructive feedback on what they're doing. Relationships. We need a just culture that's not subjected to unacceptable behavior. So we need an organization that really promotes the positive behaviors that we're looking for in everyone. If you're in an organization right now that celebrates a burnout culture, then it's going to be a difficult change for you. Employees need to share information relevant to their work and give them the tools in order to do that. And the organization has to also have agreed policies and procedures to prevent or resolve unacceptable behavior, the just culture I was talking about. And ensure systems are there to enable and encourage managers to deal with unacceptable behavior, but also for employees to report unacceptable behavior in a confidential fashion. The next one is role, understanding role and responsibilities, understanding what they're fundamentally there to do, having clarity in that area. Organization must ensure that different requirements are compatible, that they're not working against each other, and that the organization provides the information to enable the employee to understand their roles and responsibilities. As far as possible, the requirements are clear and the systems are in place to enable employees to raise concerns. And lastly, it's change. And change is huge, and especially with the pandemic and the amount of merger and acquisition activity that's going on, the layoffs that have happened, the rehiring, everything's changed. Everything's changed. And so the organization would do well to provide timely information and ensure adequate employee consultation, make the employees aware of the probable impact of the changes to their jobs, and make sure they're aware of the timetables and the relevant support they have during the changes. And all of that information there was in the Farmer-Stevenson report, so the Stevenson-Farmer report. So I started by saying I wasn't going to give opinion, etc., and I have. This has been derived from a scientifically valid study. And as far as a framework goes, for us going forward, everything you do, in my opinion, and this is an opinion, should start with a risk assessment, should start with a recognition of your threat landscape, should start potentially, depending on what the risk assessment tells you, with consultation with a competent party. But these areas here, fundamentally, as far as a strategy for change within your organization, I think they're excellent. So the first steps, what do we do? Well, start thinking about securing the stakeholders. Start thinking about having those conversations, and I've seen steering groups work really well in the past. So think about that. Get yourself some senior line managers in there. Obviously, HSE should have a place at that table, as should HR, as well as occupational health practitioners, and of course the workforce. They need to be represented heavily within the change. So here's our first steps. Assemble the stakeholders. After that, we're looking at our risk assessment. And within our risk assessment, we're going to follow down the 6 areas that we talked about. And we can find that on the HSE's website. We're going to have a look at the demands, we're going to have a look at the control, we're going to have a look at the support, the role, the change, and the relationships. Those 6 critical key areas that Stevenson-Farmer identified. Now, an awful lot of the data we need, we might already have. So have a look at the likes of the surveys, the sickness absence data, the staff turnover rates, exit interviews, etc. And these are going to be able to tell us on our risk assessment from our 6 key areas. So we're on our risk assessment, we know what the hazards are, and then we come down and we're right, who could get hurt? And we could already have the data to tell us who has been hurt previously. And then obviously we need to forecast that threat landscape, see if the organization's in the same kind of rhythm so that the same people are going to continue to get hurt. And if it's not, then we need to find out who else is now in that danger zone, so to speak, so we can include them within the risk assessment. We then need to evaluate those risks. So again, HSE website is the place that I would point you for this, but just creating, as I've done here, some really easy questions in order to start that intelligent risk-based conversation, but also to consistently ask the same so that you have data that you can generalize within a senior leadership team meeting, where ultimately you'll be looking for that budget to be unlocked. The next one is evaluating the steps, evaluating the risks, and so the likes of develop the implementation and action plans that you've come up with from your hazards, your form of hazard, your form of risk, your evaluation of risk, who can be hurt, and then we need a plan in order to bring that down to a level that is reasonably practicable. And finding an ALARP level within mental health is a tricky place. So where does the law of diminishing returns, when we put in more controls, actually start and stop? And how do we recognize that? That again is a debate for your senior leadership team, or bring in a professional that specializes in this area. Monitor and review, which is where an awful lot of an HSE professional's time is taken up, and something that if that's you, if that sounds familiar, something I would ask you to review and say if perhaps you stopped spending so much time in the monitor and review stage, spent more time in the proactive stage, so you didn't have to monitor and review relatively negative results, it might bear fruit. But the monitor and review part is essential. So what we need to do is monitor the actions in the plan to ensure they have the desired effect, and they're on the schedule, they're on the time scale, and ultimately that they're giving us the outcomes that we wanted. So here's some sobering thoughts for you before I go and before I open up the questions. Only 11% of employees discuss, these are figures from, unless otherwise stated, from 2020, 2021. Only 11% of employees discussed a recent mental health problem with their line manager, and half of employees say they would not discuss mental health with their line manager. As I started this webinar by saying, managing your employees' mental health risk, managing the hazards that could impact their mental health within your organization is a legal stipulation. It's not a choice. So to have over half of employees say that they would not discuss mental health with their line manager is like saying they would not discuss their safety with their line manager whilst conducting their tasks. It's just not realistic. We need to do better. Only 24% of managers have received some form of training on mental health at work. 76% of managers have therefore not received any training on mental health at work. 8 in 10 employers report no cases of employees disclosing a mental health condition. Considering the statistics that we were given at the start of this webinar, if you haven't had a reported case of poor mental health within your organization, it does not mean that there is no cases of mental health illness within your organization. It just means that it's not been reported, which is something, again, there is a moral, legal, and economic argument that you need to know about these things. Only 11% of the top 100 companies in Great Britain have disclosed information about their initiatives to support their employees' mental health in their annual reports, which is pitiful, but hopefully will be changing in light of ESG and the focus that that's bringing onto subjects such as mental health. And overall, around 4 in 10 organizations have policies or systems in place to support employees with common mental health issues. So that in itself could be seen as a positive or as a negative. So as I started the webinar by saying, who am I? Why am I here? Well, hopefully I went over that. We didn't attempt at a cost estimate. We found out how much it costs organizations, how much it costs in terms of the UK economy, which can then be extrapolated down to industry, how many work days are lost. But as we also discussed, it's a very prudent estimate. We rationalized the commercial case. We talked about return on investment on a number of different initiatives. And then we talked about those core standards and with a framework for all organizations. After that, we took the Stevenson Farmer report, the framework, which has been turned into what is commonly known as the management standards from the HSE, which is, again, free on their website. And we talked through those 6 areas, those 6 umbrellas. And then we talked about the first steps. We talked about fostering the interested parties, fostering the stakeholders, sorry, making sure that we had the right people on our side, and how we would go through the risk assessment process, which would then inform everything else that we do. And so how we address mental health risk in your management system. This presentation is a good place to start. Am I right in everything I say? I like to think I'm right in most of it, but I would also ask you to conduct your own study, conduct your own research. Every organization is different. Everyone has a different risk profile. But what I definitely am right about is that we all need to do more. So thank you very much. And I'd love to take any questions.
Thank you, Steve. A really interesting and informative session again. So yeah, we do have a range of different questions. So this first person is asking this firmly tongue-in-cheek. So what he's asking is, what's your view on Dom Cooper's opinion that mental health isn't included under the SWA, and that the reported cases are growing because they are an excuse? Isn't this harmful to the debate, if there even is one, when a renowned health and safety speaker is saying this publicly?
Yep, and I'm probably not going to answer this in the way that the asker wants me to, and I do appreciate as well that they made it obvious that it was tongue-in-cheek. But I follow Dom Cooper's work quite closely. I've got an awful lot of respect for him. I think it would be amiss of me to say that every single HSE professional agrees on everything that they talk about. I understand his perspective, and as with most things that Don talks about, he gives a really good rationale behind why he believes what he believes. But for me, what the figures give us from the HSE is a clear indication that we have an issue. Would I ever say that they are completely binary and an exact quantification of the problem we have? No, and I don't think the HSE would either. But do they point us in the right direction? Yeah, I think they do. Was I political enough there?
Perfect, thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much.
So the next question, this person agrees that the introduction of mental health first aiders are a reactive control, but couldn't they also be considered as being proactive?
Very much so. And I'd like to say that I support mental health first aiders. I've ensured that mental health first aiders were trained in a number of the organizations that I've consulted with and that I've actually headed up HSE for. And what mental health first aiders get is a really good grounding in knowledge. And I've had my mental health first aiders come back and run lunch and learns and come up with initiatives that we can run within the organization, and they really are, they're a source of fantastic information. But what I don't want companies to do, especially in senior positions, is think that a mental health first aider is a solution, because it's just one part of a far bigger solution that's really needed. As we saw with the timeline formatted return on investment that I gave, a mental health first aider is great, and they should be there in the same way as we need a first aider, but we also don't need to overburden the mental health first aider, who has a job to do in themselves, with doing lots of proactive things. So mental health first aiders, I'm a big fan, but it's a string to a bigger bow.
Okay, thank you. And how do you prioritise investment in mental health programmes? So how do you determine for a small company which will have the highest impact?
It's a brilliant question, and one of the most frustrating things is that the vast majority of the UK workforce is involved within small to medium-sized enterprises, and a smaller proportion of the workforce is involved in large organisations that can afford to put real punching power behind mental health structure and initiatives, etc. So you have this group of SMEs who are fantastically brilliant at what they do and well motivated, but they don't necessarily have the understanding of the resources. So it's a perfect question of how do you prioritize? And once again, what I would point you back to would be your risk assessment. So a risk assessment, you bespoke and tailored to your own organization. What are the hazards? How am I going to hurt people? Who am I going to hurt? What's happening in the industry just now? How can I inform myself before I do this risk assessment? I can access those HSE numbers and start to get, as we did in the presentation, we can start to find vulnerable groups. But those vulnerable groups might not necessarily be applicable to your organization, but there could be threads of learning there, and go through and highlight yourself and get it in your risk register. Are you going to do it right all the time? No. Are you going to pick out the right vulnerable groups? Possibly, but is that a predictor that they are the ones that are actually going to fall first? You can only do your best, but you sleep well at night knowing that you've done your best. So that risk assessment is critical, and a legal obligation as well.
Okay, thank you. And sort of linked with that, this person is asking about if you've got any hints or tips about measuring where they are now, so where the organisation they're working in, what's their baseline, apart from things like questionnaires and surveys, where they don't think they're getting sort of a true reflection of the workforce.
Yeah, if you want to go binary, then go to HR and try and get them to open up. So what you'll see in HR is you should be able to get numbers back from accessing your employee assistance program. You should never ever get any content or detail or be able to be told who accessed that program. And if you do get told that, then you've got bigger issues in the organization. Have a look at the exit interviews and what questions are going to be asked. Make sure the right questions are asked. Have a look at turnover rates. Have a look at absence rates. You should be able to get the reasons for the absence from your HR department. Again, if that starts to go down to individuals' names, then you have a data issue within your organization. But asking people what's good for their mental health is not necessarily the way forward. If you ask me, what do I want for dinner? I will tell you, I want beef burgers 7 days a week, because I love beef burgers. However, once I'm informed about what beef burgers actually do to me, and I speak to a doctor, suddenly I realize that I don't need beef burgers 7 days a week. So asking somebody in a workplace what is good for them, you may very well get back, I want beef burgers every day, and that's not actually what's good for them. So certainly speak to the workforce, take their views on board, but also remember that you're asking a party that is giving you a subjective opinion. Your job as a leader and as a manager is to then objectify the outcome and give black and white data-driven decisions on the back of it. And you can get that from generally your HR outputs.
Okay, thank you. So this is somebody that's in a leadership position, and they've been doing a lot of work on work-life balance with their teams.
Excellent.
And they're saying that it's very difficult when they have other people within the C-suite who don't practice what they are advising. So
Yeah.
there's mixed messages going out. So what advice could you give them to overcome this?
Well, first of all, well done. And you have my utter respect for doing what you're doing. It's about, for me, it's about trying to tag it back to the organizational values and ultimately having the big decision maker, or if the big decision maker isn't falling into line, then recruiting the board to help after that. And if you can't do that, then perhaps, unfortunately, you might need to look at working somewhere else. But you get those big decision makers in line, and I've seen it being done in a number of ways. I've seen it being done tying mental health back to the values. I've seen it being done tying mental health back to a return on investment and an absolute open and shut business case of why it needs to be done. And again, HR should be able to help you with that. But one of the most effective things that I've seen done, and I wasn't initially a big fan of this, was I've seen a mental health charter be made within a senior leadership team, and they created it and then they signed up to it. And what the mental health charter gave was, I think in the instance I'm thinking about, there was about 6 behaviors that every member of the leadership team signed this charter and signed that they would demonstrate these 6 behaviors, which made it much, much easier for other members of the SLT to then pull up those that were straying, saying, no, we agreed on the 11th of April, there's your signature, you need to do this. But ultimately, what we're talking about here is behavioral change, and it won't happen overnight. So good luck with your journey and keep fighting the good fight, because it is the good fight.
Yes, they've just come back and said they like the idea of the charter, so I think they won't be taking that one on. So that's all the questions we've got for this afternoon, Steve. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. And in fact, somebody has just commented that they found the webinar very easy to follow. Hard to believe it was only just an hour. You packed so much in. They thought it was very thought-provoking, and they particularly liked the comparison about not addressing mental health is a tantamount to not addressing safety. So thank you for that. Thank you to everybody that's joined us this afternoon. The recording will be on the IIRSM Resource Hub either later today or tomorrow, so you'll be able to recap and catch up on anything in your own time. So we'll end the webinar here. Hope you all have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you again at another IIRSM webinar in the near future. Thanks again, Steve. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.